Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 76 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and hopefully helpful information that pilots like you can put to use someday. Today, we're going to be talking about my experience over the last couple of weeks getting a type rating in the new Cirrus Vision Jet. And we'll talk about what it's like to fly that amazing airplane. Plus, we'll have listener feedback and be answering listener questions. Coming up on the news, a Delta pilot and 3 other pilots are accused of falsifying their medical records, and we'll tell you how they got caught. The NTSB has released a preliminary report on a Gulfstream jet that nearly landed on a taxiway with 4 waiting airliners in Philadelphia, and we'll tell you how close that jet came. There's a proposal for voluntary ADS-B installations for VFR pilots in one country, and we'll give you the details. And finally, general aviation pilots are flying relief missions right now in the Carolinas, and we'll tell you how you can help. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot and hopefully have some fun along the way. And I'll be sharing my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. These days, of course, I spend most of my time flying Cirrus aircraft like the SR-20 and 22 and now the SF50 Vision Jet. And if you're new to our show, in episode 75, we talked about mental health and depression among pilots. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AJC.com, that's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a Delta pilot accused of lying about mental health issues to keep flying. Now, this is kind of timely since we were just talking about mental health in the prior episode. A Delta Airlines pilot from Fayette County, which is in Georgia, has been indicted on charges he misled government officials about his mental health so that he could keep flying. Adam Asselson, 39 of Peachtree City, is accused of falsifying FAA medical records required to obtain an airman's medical certificate. The FAA alleges that Asselson, who joined Delta in 2017, according to his Facebook page, omitted that he had sought help from the Department of Veterans Affairs for what the indictment described as a major depressive disorder. Instead, Asselson, who has been a pilot in the U.S. Air Force previously, is said to have told the agency he received the VA disability benefits for knee strain and tinnitus. Asselson's attorney could not be reached immediately for comment. Delta said in a statement that Asselson is no longer actively flying for the carrier. Quote, Delta pilots are held to the highest standards of professionalism, honesty, and integrity, according to spokeswoman Catherine Simmons. She said, once made aware of the situation, we opened an internal investigation and we are working cooperatively with the authorities. Now, the indictment came as the FAA has begun to compare VA records with pilot information to avoid the possibility of having someone at the controls who has had mental health issues. The downing of Germanwings Flight 9525 in 2015 put a spotlight on mental health after the plane's co-pilot, who had been treated for suicidal tendencies and had been ruled unfit to work but kept the diagnosis secret, intentionally crashed a plane into a mountainside in the Alps. Asselson is one of 4 airline pilots from across the nation indicted in August in U.S. District Court in San Francisco for making false statements to the FAA in their medical certificates paperwork. The 4 men, who are receiving disability benefits from the FAA for mental health issues, are accused of neglecting to disclose information that would have disqualified them from operating aircraft. Asselson was arrested August 28th and released on a $10,000 bond, according to records. Asselson is set for his first appearance October 3rd in U.S. District Court in San Francisco. He faces a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000 if convicted. And I found some additional information on the oig.dot.gov website. That would be the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation. It says 4 pilots charged with lying to the FAA. On August 23rd, the U.S. District Court in San Francisco indicted 4 airline pilots for making false statements to the FAA. The defendants, Gregory Chrisman of Burlingame, California, Nicholas Beyer of Discovery Bay, California, Adam Asselson of Peachtree, Georgia, and Walter Grant of Fortuna, California, were charged in 4 separate indictments. Each indictment alleges the pilots submitted falsified medical records to FAA in order to obtain their airman medical certificates. While claiming to be medically fit to fly aircraft, the defendants received disability benefits from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, for serious medical and psychological conditions that would have prevented them from operating an aircraft. So I included this story because I think it highlights a dilemma anytime we as pilots are filling out information for the FAA. I thought of this last week when I was doing my check ride. Obviously, if you lie on a medical, that's making a fraudulent statement, which is a federal crime. Likewise, if when you are filling out a form on IACRA before a check ride, If you put in estimates of your flight time that turn out to be higher than your actual flight time, that's also considered a fraudulent statement, and it's a federal charge if you're caught doing that. So when I was getting my paperwork submitted for my check ride for the Cirrus Vision Jet last week, I was asked what my hours were, and I said, no, just go ahead and leave those blank. Now, the argument has always been that when you do a check ride, if you were to subsequently lose your logbook, yet having entered all of your hours would give you some record of what your total hours were at that particular point in time. In this particular case, to me, it was just easier to say, nope, don't enter any of the hours, because that way I can't be construed as having made any type of fraudulent statements. From the StarTribune.com, the NTSB says a plane flew 200 feet over other planes in Philadelphia. Investigators say a small plane that was aiming to land on a taxiway instead of the runway came within about 200 feet of striking another plane on the ground in Philadelphia. The NTSB issued a preliminary report on the August 10th incident at the Philadelphia International Airport. According to the NTSB, the pilot of a Gulfstream charter flight operated by Pegasus Elite Aviation pulled up about 1/10 of a mile from the end of the taxiway where 4 airline regional jets were waiting. Lights identifying the runway and the approach path to the runway were out of service at the time of the 8:50 p.m. incident, according to the NTSB. No injuries were reported. There were 4 passengers and 3 crew members on the Pegasus jet. Now, the incident is eerily similar to the one last year in San Francisco, in which an Air Canada jet mistakenly aimed to land on a crowded taxiway and flew just over the tops of 4 airliners that were waiting to take off. The NTSB is scheduled to hold a hearing on this case September 25th. From Flying Magazine, in a story written by a friend of the show, Rob Mark, surprising details emerged from a Cessna 335 crash that crashed earlier this month as it approached Florida's Lantana Airport. The 335, he notes, is an unpressurized version of Cessna's once popular Cessna 340. The pilot was last heard on a common traffic advisory frequency indicating he was making his turn to base leg for landing on runway 16. A few seconds later, the airplane hit the ground a mile northeast of the airport and was destroyed. The post-crash fire claimed the lives of the 2 people on board, the pilot Philip Castronova and his wife Mandy. Weather at the time of the accident was reported as good visibility with the light winds from the southwest. A reporter for the Palm Beach Post, Alexandra Seltzner, received a tip from an unnamed pilot about the status of the pilot's certificate. Following the lead, Seltzner learned that Philip Castronova did not hold a valid pilot certificate. In fact, the FAA reported Castronova's certificate had been revoked in September of 1997, that's about 21 years ago, for making fraudulent or intentionally false claims on his application for a medical certificate. The Post reporter also learned that, quote, just months before the revocation, the FAA had suspended his license for 180 days for a variety of violations, including flying in poor weather without the proper credentials and not having a current medical certificate. He also didn't give his certificate to an FAA inspector when requested, didn't listen to air traffic controllers, and operated his plane in a careless or reckless manner, records show, unquote. FAA records seem to indicate that Castronova never attempted to get his pilot certificate or medical back after the 1997 revocation. His wife also did not hold a pilot certificate of any kind. The final data point recorded for the accident on FlightAware indicated the aircraft was 400 feet above the ground, flying at 117 knots, but with a vertical descent rate of nearly 1,000 feet per minute. And there aren't many people who kind of slip through the net like this, flying for years without a license. I suspect there probably were a few pilots there who knew that. And I've got to say, when you see people who are doing illegal activity, often it catches up with them and you may be doing them a favor just to let the FAA know. So anyway, give that some thought anytime you run into people who are not playing by the rules. From avweb.com, LSA news about vans. They are taking their RV-12 assembly in-house. The world's largest kit aircraft manufacturer is about to become the world's newest aircraft manufacturer. Vans Aircraft has announced it will expand its Aurora, Oregon facility to build its popular RV-12 light sport aircraft. Factory-built RV-12s have been available for several years, but Vans contracted out the building of them to Synergy Air. Vans is now bringing the operation in-house and building a new assembly line. It will continue its relationship with Synergy as a builder-assist facility. Quote, as the SLSA program has matured, Vans has expanded its workforce and capabilities to include marketing and aircraft construction, according to a press release. They say that the change represents the next logical step in both companies' successful business growth. Van says there will be no price increase and pledges to maintain the build quality that Synergy achieved. Quote, Synergy Air has been Van's assembly partner since the launch of the RV-12 SLSA program and has done a tremendous job for Vans and our customers, unquote. The new factory will make the RV-12 IS and the RV-12 IST models, and the move is not expected to affect delivery schedules for aircraft already on order. From Flying Magazine, ForeFlight has a new feature called Trip Assistant. The new resource adds a whole new layer of support, making general aviation journeys more predictable. ForeFlight's founder and CEO, Tyson Weiss, says the feature was developed to help ForeFlight employees who needed to know how long a trip would take or when to leave their home to get to a meeting on time. Quote, Trip Assistant is a tool that any aircraft user can use to quickly compute total trip time, even when fuel stops are required. Trip Assistant is easy to use. You simply enter business names, street addresses, or names of places such as the departure and destination points, and the system suggests airports near the departure and destination as well as driving directions. Setting a departure time will make the system calculate a time, and setting an arrival time will produce a departure time required to get to the destination on time. Trip Assistant also recommends fuel stops on the way if necessary. Trip Assistant is free with a subscription to either ForeFlight's Performance Plus or Business Performance Plus services. And this certainly resonates with me as a feature. I don't know about you, but I find that just about any time I'm leaving for a long trip via GA aircraft, I always seem to leave late. I don't know why, but this certainly sounds like it could possibly help. From iPadPilotNews.com, Garmin buys FlightPlan.com. That's FLT plan.com. Whereas the market was once packed with dozens of small companies with similar apps, lately pilots have chosen between just a few big players. In fact, our latest survey showed that over 90% of GA pilots are flying with either ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, or FlightPlan Go. That trend looks set to continue or even accelerate as Garmin announced they have acquired FlightPlan.com, including the popular flight planning website and EFB, that would be electronic flight bag apps. FlightPlan.com has a large user base, especially among turbine pilots and charter fractional companies. The company claims they have 165,000 registered users who create more than 6 million flight plans per year, over 50% of all N-registered flight plans. Do the math and you find that FlightPlan.com customers are filing an average of 36 flight plans per year. The deal raises some important questions, too. FlightPlan.com's business model is quite different from Garmin's. Their apps and website are free, supported by a combination of ads and premium services. Garmin apps, by contrast, require an annual subscription. Both companies offer iOS and Android versions of their apps. Will the apps stay separate? Jessica Koss of Garmin says the plan for now, quote, we have no plans to discontinue the FlightPlan Go app and view the app as a growth opportunity. We also plan to continue to grow and invest in Garmin Pilot and its existing services well into the future and view this as a significant opportunity for both Garmin Pilot and FlightPlan Go. In international news, this comes from Reuters.com. It says China says they will seek private investment in GA airports. China's state planner said it will encourage and seek to attract private investment to help build general aviation airports to improve transport connectivity and curb local government debt risks. The National Development and Reform Commission made the comments in a statement published on its website. China has been looking to spur its fledgling general aviation industry, which uses aircraft such as private jets and helicopters. It has also said that it wants to open China's broader aviation industry up to more private investment. Interesting story. So if you're looking to invest in aviation, maybe your dollars are welcome in China. This next story comes from Down Under, from australianflying.com.au. It says that CASA plans to pursue a low-cost ADS-B for VFR. The Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, announced that it will implement a low-cost ADS-B option for VFR aircraft after consultation revealed wide industry support for the idea. All IFR aircraft must have certified ADS-B fitted by 2020, but owners of VFR aircraft were left to fit the equipment voluntarily. The cost and complexity of installing IFR-compliant technology proved a disincentive, ensuring a low uptake. Quote, the visual flight rules community appreciates the safety benefits ADS-B technology offers, according to CASA CEO Shane Commodity. He said, but the community has called for CASA to make the technology more accessible with avionics that are cheaper and less onerous to install. The challenge has been to find the right solutions and incentives that will encourage fitment and uphold an acceptable level of safety, unquote. Following feedback received through industry consultation earlier this year, CASA will now propose to relax the equipment and installation standards for ADS-B in VFR aircraft. The changes would allow some uncertified avionics that meet a recognized standard for ADS-B to be classed as a minor modification and enable amateur-built and sport aviation aircraft operators to install ADS-B under self-administration. Among the feedback CASA received was strong support for VFR ADS-B, provided it remained voluntary and was a low-cost solution. An NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, detailing the new regulations is expected before the end of the year. And finally in the news, from NorthCarolinaHealthNews.org, medical and other supplies fly their way to Florence flooded areas. And for folks outside the United States, Florence is a large hurricane which struck the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina about a week ago. And while the winds were not as strong as originally predicted, it moved extremely slowly, and so it dumped a huge amount of rain in these states. According to this story, for the past week, squadrons of pilots have descended onto the tarmac at the GA portion of Raleigh-Durham Airport, bringing their small planes and a willingness to ferry essential supplies to a coast isolated by flooding. Pilot Ken Haleen from Southern Pines summed up what was driving the dozens of pilots and hundreds of volunteers who came together to gather food, water, clothing, cleaning, and medical supplies for air shipments to parts of the North Carolina coast inaccessible by road for more than a week. Quote, "I've been lucky, blessed," he said, as he got ready to make his sixth flight on his plane, which has a payload of 1,500 pounds. Quote, "Giving back is something that's important," unquote. By the end of Saturday, volunteer pilots had flown 430 flights to deliver 248,000 pounds of supplies, which went largely to shelters. Operation Airdrop was organized in the immediate wake of Hurricane Harvey last year, which flooded Houston and other parts of southern and eastern Texas. Ethan Garrity was among other pilots as well as air traffic controllers who organized a similar airlift of supplies into areas affected by flooding, ferrying 250,000 pounds of supplies in 8 days. The group also responded to Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Florence is their third foray into performing air relief work. And longtime listeners will recall that just about this time last year in episode 30, I interviewed Doug Jackson, the founder of Operation Airdrop, and we talked about their Hurricane Harvey relief efforts. And I'll put links in the show notes to 2 different websites on Facebook related to Operation Airdrop. One of them just posted here a few minutes ago that 6 days, 516 flights, 280,000 pounds of material shipped. It's not clear to me whether those operations will continue starting on Monday, but check the websites. If you have an aircraft, perhaps you'll be able to help. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, I'm going to be talking about flying the Cirrus Jet and what it takes to get a type rating in the Cirrus Vision Jet. Plus, listener feedback and questions. One listener wants to know what an ANR headset would do for him. He says he flies a Waco UPF-7, and he's been perfectly happy with his David Clarks, but he'd like to know what ANRs could do for him. Stick around because we'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Hey, in a moment, I'll talk about learning to fly the Cirrus Vision Jet, but first let me give you a few quick updates. Many of you may have noticed that I missed a few weeks producing episodes in August and September, and in the last episode I mentioned that I've been exhausted since coming back from AirVenture. Well, it turns out it was not just AirVenture that had been leaving me exhausted over the last 6 to 7 weeks, and I finally figured out what was up. So since AirVenture, I have been fairly tired in the evening, probably by about 7 p.m., which is often the time I start working on the podcast. And so instead, I've been watching reruns on television and falling asleep really early and not really understanding why I was so tired. And on some of those days, I felt like I had a very mild headache. And by the way, it was also my birthday this weekend, and I've been wondering, hey, am I just getting old and suddenly slowing down, or did I catch something in that low-cost motel that I stayed at when I was in AirVenture? But then I finally realized that August 1st was also the time I changed blood pressure medication, just about the same time I came back from AirVenture. Now, it turns out I've been taking something called valsartan, which is a generic for Diovan, but unfortunately, that medication was recalled in late July. According to the FDA, some batches included, quote, a chemical impurity called NDMA for short, and they say based on previous animal studies, the EPA considers NDMA a probable human carcinogen. Great, you're taking blood pressure medicine and you're getting a carcinogen at the same time. So anyway, my doctor switched me back on August 1 to a different medication. I didn't really think much about it, as I've rarely had side effects from the few medications I've taken over my lifetime. But my wife commented about a week ago that my personality seemed to have changed a little, and that prompted me to look up the side effects on the new blood pressure medication I was on, and wouldn't you know, it listed headaches and fatigue. Well, bingo. So a couple of days, I called my doctor, went to the pharmacy, and learned that they just started getting valsartan from a new supplier. And now I'm back on that. And guess what? I feel much better. No longer as fatigued. So I guess the moral of the story is anytime you start a new prescription, watch out for potential side effects. Anyway, I hope I'll be able to get back quickly to my regular podcast schedule here. By the way, on the last episode that I put out, I said that I would be on Simple Flight Radio being interviewed on September 9th, and you should listen. And if you went out there, you found that that was not the case. So sorry about that. They had a scheduling issue, and they bumped me back a few weeks. And so I've learned my lesson. I will let you know about the interviews you can hear after they become available rather than telling you ahead of time, since obviously things can change. Well, sad news to report here. This is kind of a follow-up to our episode 31 last year on Stan Brock. Stan was the founder of Remote Area Medical, an organization in Tennessee which has helped literally hundreds of thousands of people get access to free health care. Stan unfortunately passed away. I learned of that news just about the time I arrived in Tennessee for my Vision Jet training. And I'd actually looked up before I was arriving there to see that there was going to be a clinic relatively close to Knoxville the weekend I was going to be there. And I thought, gee, it would be fun to drive up there and to see Stan. But unfortunately, Stan died in Knoxville just a day or two before I arrived in Knoxville. So he's going to be sadly missed. I think he definitely meets the definition of a mensch, a person who is out there trying to help others in the world. And I spoke with one of the members of the board of directors of Remote Area Medical, and he told me that Stan basically donated his Social Security check every month to Remote Area Medical, and he actually lived in the warehouse facility that they had there. So he certainly did a lot to help others, and hopefully there'll be some people who will step in to follow up in his good work. So I think Stan Brock leaves a big hole in the world. He'll definitely be missed. If you didn't hear the interview, go ahead and check out episode 31, released last September in 2017. So in the last episode, I mentioned that I was worried that I was about to witness a crash. Unfortunately, since the last episode, we have had a fatal crash at my home airport. And I was thinking it's been a really long time since we've had a fatal. I went and looked it up. The last fatal crash was almost exactly 7 years ago when a twin Cessna 310 failed to climb as it took off in the fog and crashed into some high-tension towers about 50 feet off the ground, about a mile and a half away from the runway. So clearly they were not climbing as they took off in the fog. In fact, AOPA hired me to give basically a town meeting presentation here in the city of Palo Alto a month or so after that particular crash. But this one was a little bit troubling. It's, once again, one of those crashes that shouldn't have had to happen, and it unfortunately claimed the life of the pilot. This was an Angel Flight mission pilot who used to live in San Jose, which is very close by, but who had moved during retirement to Placerville, which is a couple hours away up in the Sierras, was flying an Angel Flight, and he flew from there to Redding in the earlier part of the day to pick up a mother and daughter to be taken to the Lucille Packard Hospital, which is close to my home airport here. And he asked if either of them would like to sit in the front, and they said no, they would sit in the back, which actually saved their lives because the front of the airplane apparently was completely demolished. The weather conditions that day were scattered clouds about 1,300 feet, and that may have obscured the runway a little bit from the direction that the pilot was coming. He was landing in the morning soon after 11 o'clock. He was having some difficulty spotting the airport, so he was given some directions to fly to the KGO tower, which I don't think he was familiar with. He said, "I'm having trouble locating the field. Can you tell me when I'm flying through my final?" Your traffic controller responded, "You're flying through the final now," and gave them a new heading. So clearly he is not aware of exactly where the airport was, which is kind of surprising because apparently, according to his wife, he'd been to the airport a number of times before. But I will note that in this particular case, he was flying to runway 13, and we use the opposite runway 31 probably about 95% of the time. So he could have flown in here a dozen times and never have actually used runway 13 before. So he was then given a new heading to fly, and this, of course, indicates he probably overshot the turn to final. So figure he was on roughly, 2-mile final, maybe 3-mile final, and was having to kind of S-turn a little bit back to get onto the final. He did come into to land, apparently had a bounce or two on the runway, and then he said, "I'm going to have to abort this and go around." And the tower asked if he needed assistance, and he said, "Negative, I just came in too fast." Unfortunately, almost immediately afterwards, the airplane crashed just beyond the end of the runway into a pond that's located there. Of course, the pilot died. The 2 passengers were able to climb out on the wing. One had some injuries, but is expected to recover. There were some things that were working against him besides not spotting the airport until the last moment. Coming in on runway 13 means that essentially he's going to be coming over a higher berm than would be on the other runway. So he probably was higher to begin with just as he passed over the threshold. Also, the runway is downsloping in the direction that he landed. And so that's going to lengthen the amount of landing distance that is required. He was also flying a Mooney, which of course is a relatively has fast landing speed. And then the final straw was he had a direct crosswind, so he had absolutely no headwind to help shorten his landing distance. So by being a little high, a little fast downslope, and with no headwind, he ran out of runway with 2,500 feet, chose to go around. When I say this was perfectly avoidable, I think that he probably should have just initiated the go-around much sooner. I'm guessing he probably had some indication before the bounce that this was not a stable approach, either that he was high or that he was fast. And all I can say is the one thing I hope everybody takes away from this is that if it looks like you're unstable, either you have a high descent rate or you are high or you're not on your target airspeed, then go around early. It can really save either a lot of expense if you damage the aircraft, or it could even save your life. And let me give you a quick update of where I'll be and where we might be able to meet up here. I just got back from Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was the AOPA regional fly-in. I was there for just a very short period of time. I had my check ride in Knoxville. I immediately flew out after the check ride. Got to Santa Fe the night before my presentation. Immediately after my presentation on Friday, I flew home because I'd been gone for almost 2 weeks. So sorry I didn't get to stick around and see as many people as I would like. Brian Schober, who's a listener, wrote me ahead of time and we met up there, so it was nice to meet him. And also I showed some people there how to add Aviation News Talk to their phone, so hopefully we've got some more listeners as well. So coming up real soon, I'm going to be in Carbondale, Illinois. That's the next AOPA regional fly-in, going to be October 5th and 6th. I will be giving my presentation on the Friday at 1 o'clock on Advanced IFR for 3 hours. So come on over if you'd like to say hello. I think I'll probably be around on Saturday for that particular show as well. Then next up will be Gulf Shores, Alabama, also AOPA regional fly-in October 26th and 27th, again teaching the Advanced IFR seminar. And in between those two events, I'm going to be in Las Vegas, which means essentially I'm on the road every weekend in October. But if you are going to the Cirrus M16 event, please come and say hello. I've got a presentation I'll be giving there. And I think I mentioned last week that this seminar, even though it's specifically for Cirrus, is really excellent for anybody who flies, especially higher power piston aircraft like a Cessna 182, a 206, or maybe a Mooney, a Piper, a Beechcraft, and Cirrus, of course, as well. So it's a 3-day event, lots of seminars, small trade show, really good way to sit in a lot of different seminars and learn a lot. And I think I mentioned before, probably 80% of all the material that's going to be presented and the vendors are specific to just about any GA aircraft. So just because it says Cirrus, don't let that hold you up from going. So that's going to be M16. You can find information about it at cirruspilots.org, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And I realized after I left Santa Fe that I should have told the folks there that one of the easiest way to get this show is, not go through all the rigmarole of getting a podcast player, but it's really simple to download our dedicated app. And this is a way you might want to suggest your friends who may not be familiar with podcasts get access to the show. I don't mention this often enough, so I just thought I'd make a mention that, hey, your donations through Patreon have helped fund 2 applications, one for Apple iOS and one for Android. And you're going to find both of those apps in the App Store, and you can download them just like any other app you would download to your phone. So just go out into the App Store for either Apple or Google, search for Aviation News Talk, 3 separate words. You'll find our app right there. Click on it and download it. Some of the benefits of the app are that I can also upload PDFs and videos. For example, for our last episode where we talked about mental health, I uploaded a PDF article from the FAA on depression. So anybody using the app is able to find that under the PDF tab. And I'm also able able to send out notifications. So when I thought that I was going to be live on one of the other podcasts, I was going to go ahead and send out a notification to let you know, hey, you can listen to me now. Sounds like that episode's now going to be pre-recorded, so I probably won't do that. But notifications does give me a way of letting you know things that are happening in real time. And speaking of things that are happening in real time, let me thank all the many Patreon supporters who have stuck with me through the last couple of weeks when I wasn't able to get a new show out. And some of those new Patreon supporters are Doug Wall, Frank Schlattbaum, Ed Varso, Glenn Neeson, who edited his pledge up to $10, Jimmy Tidmore, Joey Ferreira, who's from Garmin, who we interviewed on the show last year, and Brian Brisk, who also edited his pledge up to $50 a month and said he wanted to help offset the high cost of my flight training, which I really appreciate. I still haven't gotten the bill for the Cirrus Jet, and gulp, that's going to be a big one when it comes. So thank you so much for joining us as Patreon sponsors. And if you find that after you've listened to the show, you're looking for just a little bit more, go out to our Patreon site. It's very easy to find. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and that will take you directly to our Patreon site. And I post a lot of things on the blog there from time to time, and often you'll find out about stories that I talk about on the podcast a week or two or more before I talk about them on the podcast. So, for example, what's up there on that page right now, there is a hilarious story of a news reporter who talked about kind of a very simple plane crash with no injuries, in which the pilot reported to her that the potential cause of that plane crash was the flux capacitor, which, of course, is a reference to the Back to the Future movie with Michael J. Fox. So I don't know how you have the presence of mind after having an accident to feed a reporter that kind of story, but you'll find a link to that on our Patreon page. And also, I've just posted a video of someone who tried to hand prop a Cirrus earlier this month, and that went very badly. And you can imagine that the aircraft took off under its own power, not in the air, but across the taxiway. And certainly the pilot narrowly avoided getting sliced up by that propeller, all because of the security cams at the airport, which caught the entire incident. So if you haven't seen that, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and then click on the blog tab, and that's where you can see that story and the many other stories that I post between episodes. Now, at the start of each month, the first news show of the month, I read the names of our biggest supporters on Patreon who all contribute at least $20 a month or more. And these super supporters include Jeremy Zwadny, who's a software developer, Peter Long, a pilot in Australia, formerly a CFI here in Silicon Valley, Seth Lake, a military instructor, pilot, and flight instructor in Arkansas. And if you go to go.nogo.aero, you can find links to his podcast and flight school. Jason Blair, who's been on the show a couple of times. He's a DPE, a pilot examiner. His blog is at jasonblair.net. Joseph Haggerty II, he's a Mooney owner and pilot. Michael Rogers, Cirrus owner and pilot in Southern California. Michael Spain, student pilot in Oklahoma. Got to hear from Michael, find out if he's got his certificate yet. Larry Noe from New York, New York. That's the city where I used to live years ago. He flies a Bonanza G36. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, and yes, they own and operate 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Roger Griggs, he's a turbine pilot. He has a new Meridian 600, and he's got about 100 hours in that. Chuck Price, who's a local client of mine I've taught in the Cirrus, his website is Too Simple. That's tusimple.ai, which is for the company he works for, which does artificial intelligence for self-driving tractor-trailer trucks. Also, Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot who runs a training center for a very large airline. He also owns a Bonanza F-33A and recently reinstated his CFI, so congratulations to him. Stella Sue, a student pilot in the SR-20, who I fly with. Thank you, Stella. Jonathan Weisswasser, who's a vascular surgeon and also a ham radio operator, inactive like me, and he flies a Meridian. Jim Bareth, he runs Sonics ESD, which specializes in active noise control. He's out of the Monterey, California area. Fabio Comalis, who's a MD, and I helped him bring his Cirrus back from the East Coast a few months ago. Lance Fletcher, he's a former crew chief in the Air Force on an F-111F. He says he's wanted to learn to fly for decades, and he's finally taken the plunge. So we welcome him to the Aviation Club. Joseph Morales, patent lawyer in Maryland. He's a former National Guard Black Hawk pilot who's planning to work on his commercial and CFI. Moj Kazi, a software developer here in Silicon Valley who helps me out with our aviationnewstalk.com website. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight. I think most of you are familiar with ForeFlight. I want to thank him for his very generous support. Adam Nunn, I think he's out of Texas. He flies a Piper Cherokee. And Chris Carnahan, he flies a 1955 VTAL Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis, Missouri, which is probably where I'll be flying in and out of to get to Carbondale, Illinois. Anthony Pitt, he's a private pilot in sunny Brisbane, Australia. He flies a 172 out of a club at the Redcliffe Airport. And Jeffrey Bell, he's a general surgeon who is working on his CFI certificate. We've got a common theme here, people working on their CFI. He also flies the Citation Bravo and a couple of other airplanes. Brian Brisk, who just jumped his contribution from $2 a month to $50 a month. He's at the ATP school at Centennial Airport outside of Denver. Thanks very much, Brian. And finally, David DeCurtis, who has a listener question he submitted on turbine operation that we'll get to here shortly. So thanks so much to everyone who supports the show at whatever level you do. Again, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And if you'd like to sign up to send us a few dollars each month, that would be great. But if not, just go ahead and enjoy all the extra web content that we have posted there for you. Now stick around because in 7 seconds, we're going to be back talking about what it's like to fly the Cirrus Vision Jet and get a type rating. We'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Let's talk about the Cirrus Vision Jet. Boy, oh boy, this makes me smile and grin and think about this. I flew out on Labor Day to Knoxville, Tennessee, and the following day started my training, which lasted about 10 days. I had one day off in the middle. So basically, I spent essentially 2 weeks there, and it was great fun. It was kind of like being at Disneyland for pilots. Now, the downside is it was not inexpensive, but I will say that this is probably the only aviation item that I had on my bucket list. So just had to do it. And fortunately, I don't really live an extravagant lifestyle. I don't go on expensive vacations. I don't drive an expensive foreign car. So yes, the cost was over $20,000, but it was a once in a lifetime experience, which probably won't replicate, but it was great, great, great fun. So we talked about the Vision Jet extensively back last year in episode 11, but let me go ahead and give you just a general overview of the aircraft. First, it's the only certificated single-engine jet. Yes, there are experimental single-engine jet kits that you can build, and yes, there are certain single-engine military jets, but this is the only certificated single-engine jet, certainly in the U.S., and I believe in the world. Now, coincidentally, I just heard Cirrus's regional sales director, Gary Black, talk about the beginning of the jet 10 years ago. He was on the AOPA Hangar Talk podcast, episode 53, earlier this month, and he mentioned something that I hadn't heard, which was that when they were designing the Cirrus Vision Jet, they figured out that they could pretty much get about the same power from a single jet engine as they could from a pair of jets used in the Eclipse jet. And while traditionally you might want a two-jet engine so that you'll have a backup in case one jet were to fail, Cirrus, of course, does have a backup if their single jet engine fails, and that is the whole airframe parachute. So, of course, having a single jet engine meant that you couldn't hang it off the side of the fuselage or the wings as you would in a traditional aircraft. So instead, it was mounted on top of the jet. But since the exhaust would be blowing directly onto the vertical stabilizer of a traditional tail, Cirrus had to go for the V-tail that you see in older Bonanzas so that the exhaust would pass directly between the rudder vaders and not onto some part of the plane that might get heated up by the exhaust. So it was about 10 years ago that Cirrus announced the Vision Jet and started taking deposits for it. Now, I don't know if you remember that time, but there were several other manufacturers that were taking deposits for their personal jets, some of which were also single engine. But Cirrus is the only one besides the Eclipse that made it to market. So back in 2008, the price was estimated on the Cirrus Jet to be about $1.25 million. The price did gradually increase over the years depending upon when a buyer placed their deposit. Today, I think the jet sells for around $2 million. Let me just throw out some general specs, a few of the many that you would be expected to memorize if you were also getting your Cirrus Jet type rating. There are a total of 7 seats in the aircraft, so you can have up to 7 people, though the 2 seats in the very back are limited to just 90 pounds each. All 5 of the passenger seats are removable, which could save you some weight if you wanted to. Wingspan on the aircraft, 38.7 feet, and I believe that was chosen so that the aircraft would have a chance of fitting into a standard-sized T-hanger, which is pretty remarkable. The height, pretty high. It's about 10.9 feet, and that takes you to the top of the rudder vaders. And I must say, those surfaces are really large. It's a pretty big tail on this aircraft. Length of the aircraft is just under 31 feet. Max gross weight is 6,000 pounds, and the maximum usable fuel is 296 gallons. The engine is the Williams FJ33-5A, which is rated at 1,846 pounds of thrust. I was able to remember that because 1846 was the beginning of the Mexican-American War. Anyway, the engine only weighs about 310 pounds. Now, here's a fun fact. The engine is mounted in a titanium containment vessel. So if there were an engine fire, the heat can be kept out of the passenger compartment below. Now, if you're in a traditional jet, if an engine were to catch fire, it just kind of burns through the pylon and falls off the jet, but that's not an option in this design. So hence the titanium firewall is underneath the engine and between it and the cabin, and also goes all around the engine. Now, the engine is a medium bypass engine. That means that more than 50% of the air goes around the core of the jet. So in this particular case, the air splits as it enters the engine. A little less than 50% of the air goes straight through the middle of the engine, through the core and through the combustion area. But over half the air bypasses the engine core, goes around that core, and then rejoins the hot exhaust in the mixer area at the rear of the engine. Benefits of a bypass engine, well, it's going to be more fuel efficient because you're not sending all that air through the combustion chamber, though it is going to be slower than if 100% of the air went through the core. In this case, the max cruise speed is about 300 knots. Now, depending upon the throttle setting, you're going to burn somewhere around 60 gallons per hour once you're up in altitude. Ceiling on this aircraft, flight level 280. Now, above that altitude, the aircraft would need to have been certified for RVSM, which allows you to fly at altitudes at flight level 29,000 feet above. And that, I think, would have been more expensive, probably would have delayed the initial certification. I'm guessing that at some date they may do that, so the jet might go higher then. Stall speed is just 67 knots with full flaps. VREF, or the approach speed on final, is around 90 knots, so that means it's landing only about 10 knots faster than a Cirrus SR-22, and in some ways I think that makes the transition to the plane a lot easier for people who are Cirrus SR-22 pilots and who are stepping up to the Vision Jet. Now, the jet has a good-sized baggage compartment in the back, holds up to 300 pounds. There's also an option that lets you extend the baggage compartment by 3 feet, and that also lets you take an extra 40 pounds of weight in the back. Now, I think one of the most distinguishing features about this aircraft, aside from its stunning looks, I mean, it just really looks spectacular on the ramp. But I think one of the most spectacular features is the panoramic wraparound windshield, because it really provides, I think, exceptional visibility. Now, there is one post that goes down the center of the windshield, but other than that, there's really nothing blocking your view out the window. So you can really pretty much see from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock with just that one post in the center. Now, I did mention back in episode 11 that climbing in and out of the jet and into the front seat is easier than any small jet I've ever been in. I've taught before in the Cessna Citation. I stand a little over 6 feet tall, and I swear it takes me about 60 seconds to just contort my body into a pretzel so that I get into the front seat of that particular jet. But in the Cirrus jet, the front seats move a very long distance from their full forward position. I didn't measure it, but I'm guessing it moves a full 3 feet. And so it's just easy to slide one of the front seats back, one of them forward, and climb into the seat just about as easily as you might climb into an office chair. And that's pretty spectacular. Now, there are 3 seats in the second row, and that middle seat can be set in any of 3 different positions, which allows it to be either aligned with the second row or pushed all the way back to be part of the third row. Or there's a middle position between the 2 rows where you can kind of fold it over and rest your elbows on it, and maybe use it as a tabletop. Coming into the airplane through the main cabin door, that is a clamshell. So it's got separate upper and lower halves with steps into the lower half. There's also a separate emergency exit window on the right side next to the co-pilot. That window can be completely removed. And if you want, you could actually pass things through that window to help load the aircraft. Or it could be used as a emergency egress if your main cabin door were to become blocked in some way. Of course, One of the most distinguishing features is the CAPS parachute. It's similar to the chutes in the SR-20 and the 22, but it differs in some ways. First, it's a lot bigger. It's a full 6,000 square feet of chute material, and since it's larger, it's going to take longer to fill that chute with air. So whereas the chutes in the SR-20 and 22 can be used as low as maybe 500 or 600 feet above the ground, depending on the model, Cirrus recommends that you don't pull the SF50 Vision Jet parachute unless you're at least 1,000 feet above the ground. But, even if the engine were to fail, you might not have to pull the chute, because if you're all the way up there at flight level 280, you can glide that jet for about 50 miles. And of course, a lot of the training that I'm going to talk about involves dealing with both engine failures and deploying the CAPS parachute. And there's a pretty cool video. I'll put a link to it in the show notes here, where you can actually watch the CAPS parachute deploy on the flight test that they did when they were certifying the aircraft. So let's talk a little bit about the training. First off, you're not really able to just pick up the phone and call up Cirrus and say, I'd like to sign up for training in the Vision Jet. They just don't have the capacity to accommodate, requests from anybody who might want to do the training. So anybody who does go to the training, you've got to really be tied to the purchase of a new Vision Jet. So for example, the new owner of a jet could get training for themselves or for a professional pilot or CFI that they might be flying with in that particular jet. In my case, one of my SR-22 clients bought a Vision Jet, and he was able to get me scheduled for the training. Now, originally, Cirrus started delivering the Cirrus Jet and training new owners way back in the beginning of 2016 in the jet itself. But a couple of months ago, instead of doing all training in the jet back in July 2018, the training transferred to the multi-million-dollar simulators that Cirrus has at their Knoxville Vision Center. Now, there are two of these. One's a full-motion cockpit that's completely enclosed and mounted on large pistons, and computers, of course, cause it to roll and pitch and move all over the place. There is a huge amount of free space around the simulator, so it won't bump into the building when it's moving. And, of course, nobody can be down in that free space when the simulator is in operation. Now, they've done a beautiful job of designing the building. The simulator is next to this large glass wall so that people outside the building can actually look inside easily and see the simulator in motion really from quite a distance away. And there's room in the building for them to add on 2 more additional modules so that as their needs increase for training in the future, they could accommodate 2 more of these full motion simulators by expanding the building. Now, in addition to the one full motion simulator they have now, there's another complete full simulator that's virtually identical. It just doesn't move. So I spent a lot of time in both simulators, and frankly, the only time when I felt the motion made a really big difference was when I pulled the CAPS parachute. And I'll talk about that shortly. That's quite an experience. Now, getting trained in the Cirrus jet or any jet is not in any way like getting checked out to fly a piston aircraft. I have heard that some new Vision Jet owners have come to the factory thinking, hey, they can just get a quick checkout and fly away, but you can't do that. The reason is that the FAA requires before you fly any turbojet on your own, you are required to take a check ride for a type rating in that particular jet. And that type rating is to get this ATP certificate standards. The ATP, that's the same certificate required for airline pilots, and it's flown to some pretty exacting tolerances. So before you can fly away in your jet, you will need to take a check ride with an FAA-designated examiner. But the difference in that check ride is that you're going to be expected to know far more about the systems of this jet than for any piston aircraft you've ever been checked out in. And you'll be doing a lot of instrument approaches and maneuvers during the check ride. Now, since most all of the training, including the check ride, is done in the simulator, there are some interesting limitations on your type rating when you finish. The training is done under FAA's Part 142, and unless you have a current type rating in some other jet and meet some other additional criteria, that's spelled out in FAR 6164. And that basically says, quote, you're going to have to perform 25 hours of flight time in an aircraft of the category, class, and type for which the limitation applies under the direct observation of the pilot in command who holds a category, class, and type rating without limitations for the aircraft. And since Cirrus is the only single-engine category jet, that means after you get your type rating, you're going to have to do 25 hours in the airplane. Now, for most owners of a new Cirrus jet, much of that time will be accumulated as they fly home in their jet with a Cirrus instructor. For me, unfortunately, I don't have a jet, so it looks like I'll be facing some additional expense to either rent a jet or find other ways to accumulate that time. Now, I knew that going into the training, but I figured getting the type rating is really just the first step in a long process to eventually being able to fly the jet on my own someday, so I was willing to go ahead anyway with it. So step one of the training, got to be tied to the purchase of a new Cirrus jet, and then you need to get scheduled for a 2-week block of time at the Cirrus Vision Center in Knoxville. Step 2 is to make sure you're really as proficient as possible prior to beginning the training. And I think the best way to do that is to fly a Cirrus SR22 and fly it until you can easily pass an IPC, an instrument proficiency check, before you go for the training. Next, you can expect to receive access to the Cirrus SF50 Vision Jet online training videos. These are 2 very long video courses. One's on jet systems and one's on jet pilots. The latter one is related mostly to knowing the things that you would need to know for a high-altitude endorsement. And of course, you need one of those endorsements to fly any aircraft like the Cirrus, which is certificated to fly above flight level 250. So if you happen to have a high altitude endorsement before you show up, that is helpful. Now, let me talk about the first set of those videos, the jet system videos and the quizzes. The estimated time to view those videos and complete the quizzes is just under 8 hours. Though if you're like me, you're going to spend a lot more time than that. As I went through the videos, I made detailed notes on all the major points in the videos. And the reason I did that is I knew that I probably wouldn't fully understand and remember everything in the videos after going through them on the first pass. And for me, it's just a lot easier to go back if I scan through notes that I've made rather than try and replay all the videos. So just to give you an idea of some of the kinds of systems that you'll need to learn about, I'm going to mention each of the different subject areas that were covered in the system videos, and then maybe 1 or 2 interesting facts about each of those systems. Obviously, there's a lot of information in the videos, so I won't be discussing everything that's in them because of time limitations. So the first section is called Your Vision Jet, and it goes over some of the basics I've already talked about here. Essentially, it's an overview of the components in the airplane. Next is the exterior pre-flight, where you can watch an entire pre-flight of a Vision Jet. Next up is called the cockpit, and it tells you where all the items are located that you're going to find inside the cockpit. And by the way, I mentioned back in episode 11, I think the cockpit of the SF50 Vision Jet is probably the cleanest layout I have ever seen in any jet. I mean, it's really reminiscent of a luxury car in terms of having just a minimal number of buttons, a large amount of open space on the dash and the side panels, and having curved lines that just pleasantly blend the whole cockpit together. Next section is on avionics, which, by the way, are based on the Garmin 3000. And for that system, there are 2 large displays, a PFD on the left and MFD on the right. But unlike the SR22 or a G1000 cockpit, these displays don't have any soft keys or buttons around them, and that really reduces the number of buttons and the clutter in the cockpit. But below them, there is a set of 3 touchscreen controllers that are used for controlling everything in the PFD and the MFD. Generally, the touchscreen controller on the left controls the PFD, the one in the middle controls the MFD, and the one on the right controls the radios and intercoms. And then between the displays, there's a small center cockpit panel, and it includes a couple items such as a landing gear lever and the knob for setting the barometric pressure. Now, the next section is on the instruments, and a lot of what's covered there is similar to what you would learn if you were studying about the G1000 or the Perspective, though, of course, you're going to use different soft keys to select all the functions that are discussed. Next section is on the AFCS, otherwise known as the Automatic Flight Control System, or the autopilot. Now, almost all of these autopilot functions are going to be similar to what you'll find in a late model SR22. One difference, though, is that the Perspective autopilots had an IAS mode, which lets you climb at a constant airspeed, whereas the Perspective Plus autopilots had an FLC, or flight level change key, that performs in a similar, though slightly different way. Now, the difference between the two, which I'm not going to go into here, wasn't in the videos, but was discussed in the classroom. And I can tell you that the jet has the FLC key on the autopilot, so it operates the same as the Cirrus Perspective Plus, which was introduced in the SR22 in 2017. Now, the next group of videos and quizzes were about the in-flight radar. One of the big differences, of course, between in-flight radar and the kind of next ride weather you might see on ADS-B or if you have a Cirrus XM subscription is that in-flight radar is real time, and it can be used to try to tactically pick your way through a line of thunderstorms or bad weather. By contrast, ADS-B or Cirrus XM displays data that's usually at least 8 to 10 minutes old, even if the display says 1 or 2 minutes old. It's always at least 8 to 10 minutes old. It has it shows you where the storms were, but not where they are now. Now, my favorite section was the group of videos on the electrical system, since as an electrical engineer, that's the stuff I'm most familiar with. And as you might guess, there are a lot of similarities between the electrical system in the Cirrus SR22 and in the Vision Jet. So, for example, both have 2 batteries and both have 2 alternators, though in the Vision Jet, one of the alternators is actually a generator. And like in many jets and turboprops, this generator also gets used as a starter motor. So to start the jet, current from the battery 1 is applied to generator 1, which, by the way, is rated at 270 amps. And that generator spins N2, or the high-pressure group in the engine, until it reaches a speed at which fuel can be introduced into the engine, and then the engine can then rotate on its own. After engine start, you turn the generator 1 switch on, which then allows it to act as a generator and to recharge battery 1 through the main bus. Now, by the way, I first learned about these kinds of systems about 10 years ago after reading a book by Greg Brown, which I understand a lot of pilots use when they're preparing for their airline interviews. That book is called The Turbine Pilot's Flight Manual, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And the next group of videos and quizzes is on the primary flight controls and then on the secondary flight controls. Now, one of the most interesting parts to me was learning about the mechanical mixer system that controls the rudder vader. Now, here's the problem that the mixer was designed to solve. You can imagine you have 2 large push rods that move the 2 rudder vader control surfaces on the tail. So if you're climbing or descending, they move up or down like an elevator. But if you're in a turn, the surfaces move in different directions like ailerons to really provide a rudder type function. And if you're turning as you're climbing or as you're descending, well, you've got to move each of those surfaces the right amount, but in different directions. So you have 2 outputs from this mixer that move the rudder vader surfaces, but you have 3 inputs coming into this mechanical mixer. One is a single push rod that moves as you push and pull on the side stick to climb or descend, but also you have 2 cables that are coming in from the rudder pedals as you push them left or right in a turn. So the mixer assembly mechanically translates these 3 inputs coming from the cockpit to drive the 2 rudder vail surfaces in the tail. And I think it's an ingenious little mechanism. The next section is about the landing gear and brakes. For example, you can extend the landing gear at 210 knots, but you have to be 150 knots or slower to retract the landing gear. And I think that's probably because the nose gear retracts forward. So when you extend the gear, the wind is helping you lower the gear, but when you retract it, the gear is working against the wind. So the forces on the nose gear are going to be larger, and hence I think you're going to have to fly a slower speed to retract the gear. Fuel is the next topic of the videos. As I already mentioned, the Vision Jet can carry 296 gallons of usable jet fuel. There are minimum and maximum fuel temperatures that you'll have to know. Also, there are various caution messages that come up if you have a weight imbalance between the tanks. So the maximum fuel imbalance permitted is 15 gallons, and you'll get a yellow caution message if you ever reach that. But you should never get that imbalance unless something isn't working right, because the Cirrus Vision Jet automatically switches between the left and the right tanks every 2 gallons, which, by the way, works out to about every 2 minutes. Of course, you can manually switch the fuel tanks, and that's what you would need to do if you had some type of failure and the tanks became imbalanced. Next is the power plant, which we've talked about a little bit already. Here's one little tidbit. The maximum wind for starting the engine. You can't have greater than a 15-knot tailwind or a 25-knot crosswind. It's really best to face the jet into the wind because that'll give you an easier start and lower peak ITT temperatures. And if you're wondering, why does this matter? Think about how the air moves through the front of the engine to the rear. Essentially, the various fans and rotors in the engine are keeping the combustion where it needs to be. But if you had a really strong wind blowing up the tail, that's moving the combustion a little bit forward of where it's supposed to occur. That's going to make it harder to light off when you start it and also to keep the temperatures as low as they should be. The next two video sections are on the bleed air and pressurization. Bleed air is that compressed hot air that's pulled from the engine just before the point where combustion occurs, and it's used for cabin pressure and heating, and also for some of the de-ice and anti-ice systems. And the pressurization assures that you have an 8,000-foot cabin altitude when you're up at flight level 280. It's got a number of sensors and components to make all that happen. Now, there's also a separate air conditioning system, and that gets used mostly when you're on the ground and at low altitudes. And that's because when you're up at high altitudes, the outside air is so cold that it provides all the cold air you need in the cabin. Though that cold air doesn't directly enter the cabin because the cabin is pressurized, so that outside air is of a much lower pressure, and you need to run that through a heat exchanger to cool the bleed air, and then that outside cold air exhausts out through the rear of the cockpit. So at low altitudes, the air conditioner is really essentially cooling the high pressure air that's already inside the cabin. The next section was icing protection. That was really fascinating because the Vision Jet uses 4 separate technologies for anti-icing and de-icing of the different parts of the aircraft. A probe heat switch is used to electrically heat the pitot tube and the angle of attack vane. Bleed air is used to heat the inlet of the engine, and when turned on, it flows around the inside cowling of the engine. Conventional boots are used on the upper and lower surfaces of the wing and also on the rudder vader surfaces. And when you turn these on, these boots cycle for a few seconds out of every minute to break off any ice that's accumulated. And finally, there's a de-icing fluid, which is used to prevent ice from building up on the windshield and on top of the nose. Now, I don't think most jets have anti-icing systems to protect the nose. So I'll let you think about that for a minute before I tell you why is it important to de-ice the nose on the Vision Jet. Now, the next section covers the oxygen system. Now, that's either a 22 or 40 cubic foot cylinder in the back of the plane, depending upon whether you get the upgraded version of the oxygen or not. And it's just for emergency purposes. So imagine you lose cabin pressure and you're at a high altitude. Well, you're going to need that oxygen to help keep you conscious until you can descend to a lower altitude. It feeds either 1 or 2 quick don oxygen masks above the pilots, depending upon what options you have. And it feeds oxygen masks that are located in the ceiling of the passenger compartment. But unlike the oxygen mask you'll find in the airlines, those don't drop down automatically. So you're going to have to brief the passengers in advance on how to pull them down from the overhead compartments and then how to pull a second string to start the oxygen flow. And the next section of the videos was on fire protection. The Vision Jet has a 2-shot fire extinguisher that's located up in the engine to put out anti-engine fire. Now, there are 2 separate bottles up there, each filled with halon, and if you ever need to use one of them, you're going to follow the checklist, and eventually you get to a point where 2 overhead buttons in the cockpit become active. And then if you push one of those, a small explosive opens up one of the fire bottles and releases the halon. And of course, if you needed to do it a second time, the second button would do the same thing. By the way, I had a little fun when I was on my check ride in the simulator. I was given an engine fire. And when I got to the point where I had to push the button, I said, what did I say? I said, flood the forward tubes, open outer doors, fire 1. I was kind of pretending I was launching a torpedo from a submarine. Examiner got a laugh out of that. So it was just kind of a way to put a little humor into check rides, which can be a little bit tense. So anyway, that was kind of fun. Now, the final video section was my favorite topic, CAPS, the Cirrus airframe parachute system. Now, as of this date, the CAPS system in the Cirrus SR20 and 22 has been used a total of 78 times to save over 160 people. This system is similar, but there are some major differences. When you pull CAPS in the SR20 or 22, the parachute deploys immediately. But in the Vision Jet, when you pull the handle, the autopilot commands the jet to pitch up to slow the aircraft to below 135 knots indicated or 145 knots true airspeed, whichever is lower. And this could take up to 24 seconds. But if for some reason the aircraft hasn't reached that speed, after a total of 30 seconds, it will then deploy the parachute regardless. Another major difference, the parachute in the jet is located in the nose. So if you ever have to deploy it, you're going to get to watch it deploy, and you'll be looking at one of those straps all the way down to the ground. So I hope that gives you a feel for some of the topics that you'd be learning about in the videos. In addition to the videos, you would receive a training kit with a POH and a pilot information manual that describes the aircraft systems. And reading all of this before you arrive for training is a really good idea. Now let me talk about the actual training. The first 4 days of my training were all very similar. We'd spend the morning in the ground school reviewing presentations that go into even greater depth than the videos did. And then in the afternoon, we would climb into the non-motion simulator for a couple of hours to fly a variety of different flights. Now, those flights were primarily to get us familiar with all the buttons and to start practicing the many emergencies that we had to know. Now, I felt really lucky in the first week because I was teamed up with Daniel Stegman. Now, he's a Cirrus CSIP from Coatesville, Pennsylvania. He also does a lot of work in Cessna Citations and in the Eclipse jet. So I really benefited a lot from his experience, both during the ground school discussions and in the simulator. So if you're a Cirrus pilot in the Philadelphia area, I highly recommend Daniel for any flying that you might be doing in any of the Cirrus aircraft. Now, one of the biggest challenges I had in that first week of training was memorizing the first few steps of each of the 24 different emergencies that we had to know on our check ride. And then what I also had to do, which I had trouble remembering, was after performing those memory items, I then had to remember to bring up the emergency checklist for that particular emergency and perform all the non-memory items that would occur. So very, very few of the checklist would be complete after doing the memory items, so I had to bring up the checklist and do the non-memory items. So that complicated things a little bit. And also, partway through some of the checklist, you would have to figure out whether or not to continue with that particular part of the checklist or skip down to a later part. So there was kind of an if-then, kind of section. And then, of course, to top it off, many of these emergency checklists end by referring you to yet another checklist to complete. So this was a little tough for me to wrap my head around it initially. So to try and organize this in my head, I did two things. One was I looked at the commonality in all the memory items between all of these emergency checklists. So, for example, some of the checklists would tell you to don the emergency oxygen mask and others didn't. And then I looked at for the commonality in how all these emergencies ultimately concluded. So, for example, some of the emergencies ended with the landing without power checklist. So I actually created a flow chart for myself, grouping similar emergencies together and then tracing each of them through to their final relatively few endpoints that you could reach after completing an emergency all the way to the end. So I did have one free day during the training. That was the Sunday between the 2 weeks. So I rented a car and went hiking up in the Smoky Mountains. Now, those are the lower part of the Appalachian Mountains that I grew up in. And the big difference is up in northern Pennsylvania, we had the glaciers come through during the last ice age, and that lowered the mountains and kind of rounded them out a little bit. Glaciers didn't make it all the way down to the Smoky Mountains, so they are much sharper peaks, and they're also much higher. So I hiked to the top of Klingman's Dome, which was over 6,600 feet, which is pretty tall for mountains in the eastern half of the United States. So the second week I was back flying, but this time in the full motion simulator. And the big difference was when you pull the CAPS handle. And when you do that, oh boy, Vision Jet pitches up to at least 30 degrees. And I heard it might go as high as 60 degrees to slow the aircraft before it releases the parachute. And I got to tell you, the first few seconds of that deployment, man, it involved a lot of shaking. So much so that I would actually close my eyes because the view out the windshield was changing so rapidly. But even though it's a wild ride, I have to tell you, I would not hesitate to pull the CAPS parachute in the Vision Jet if I ever needed to do it for real. Also, during the second week, we went out and we got to fly the real jet. Now, the reason is that the training requires that the training on the stick shaker and the stick pusher be done in the real airplane, not just in the simulator. So Daniel and I did about an hour in the jet. I took off, climbed to altitude, did my 2 stalls while Daniel was sitting in the back. And then while our instructor was flying from the right seat, Daniel and I switched seats and he did his stalls and landed the airplane. Well, the end of the process, of course, was a check ride. That lasted about 6 hours. We started at 7 a.m., spent nearly an hour going through the qualification process where my DPE, who was Matt Welsh, reviewed all of my documents, my logbook, went through the IACRA system. That's the FAA's check ride system, so that he could process my application. After that, we went through the oral discussion, which I think lasted close to 2 hours, and we went into a lot of detail on each of the many systems that I just talked about here. And I also had to recall quite a few different numbers. And I think I pretty much aced the oral, but only because I started studying about a month before I went to Knoxville, and because during any free time I had in Knoxville, I was studying. After that, we went out to pre-flight an actual airplane, though we lost a half hour doing that because some other people were using the plane ahead of us teaching a pre-flight, so we had to wait till they were done so that I could do the pre-flight. After that, we got into the simulator. We spent probably around 2 hours in the sim. I had a couple of failures of various types before I even got off the ground. But then when I finally got up to altitude, flew various maneuvers, including steep turns, slow flight, and 3 different kinds of stalls, all of which, by the way, are in IMC. After that, I had to fly 4 different instrument approaches, the last of which was a circle to land approach. And shortly after that last landing, I heard Matt say those words that I was hoping for, "You passed." So that was a great relief. So let me go back. Have you figured out why it's important to keep the ice from forming on the nose of the Cirrus Vision Jet? Imagine some ice did form on the nose and then later broke off. Where would that ice go? Well, it would go back up over the windshield, and then it would go, directly into that single engine mounted on top of the fuselage, which would not be a very good idea for the fan blades in the engine. So that's why it's important to keep ice from forming on the nose, and why there's a separate anti-icing system for that in the Vision Jet. Well, just want to mention a couple folks. My instructor when I was there was Travis Wellick. He was a spectacular instructor. He has got probably about 18 months in flying in the Vision Jet, and was incredibly helpful. So I couldn't have been luckier to have him both for the ground instruction and in the simulator. John Sutherland runs the whole training group out there, and he was particularly helpful. We had some good discussions. One of our listeners was Kenny Martin. Kenny introduced himself to me. He's one of the instructors out there at Cirrus. He's from Pennsylvania, former state trooper, grew up in the northern, or not grew up necessarily, but he was working as a state trooper in the northern part of the state where I grew up. So that was kind of a fun connection to make. And then another listener said hello to me who was visiting. That would be Carl Fischbach. Carl is a CSIP instructor, and on the side, his other job is he's wing commander for a group of B-1 bombers down in Texas. Actually, I may have gotten that backwards. It might be that he's a CSIP on the side. I think his primary job is commanding the B-1 group. But he was up at Knoxville and said hello, so that was kind of a fun connection to make. All in all, a fantastic experience. And all I can say is if you ever are considering buying any kind of Cirrus, whether it's an SR-20, an SR-22, or a Vision Jet, please contact me. Be happy to help you in any way that I can. Marvelous company, great products, and I certainly had 2 wonderful weeks in Knoxville. So coming up, we've got listener feedback and questions. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'll get to listener feedback and listener questions in just a moment. But first, I want to do a quick thank you for people who have left reviews for this show at various places. And I never read the whole review, and often I just mention the person who leaves the review. So let me just go ahead and go through some of these. These reviews were on the Apple Podcast app, which was formerly known as iTunes. And we had one from Riga Runner. We had one from Jim, who says, great info for pilots. I always learn something from his interviews, especially with Jason Blair. Terrence Gordon says, a must listen to for aviators. He says he's an aerospace education officer for a Civil Air Patrol squadron. He says the commentary here is rich and relevant. Thanks so much for that. Now, we also, as you probably know, have 2 dedicated apps that you can find in the App Store for Apple and for Android phones. From the iOS app, a big thank you to C-Squared22. He says he flies a 55 VTOL pilot. Or rather, he is a 55 VTOL Bonanza pilot. So he left a review. Thanks very much on the iOS app. And then out on Android, this is the first time I've actually gone out and found these. So I've got a lot of reviews for people who are using our app on Android. Dallas Glick says, love the podcast and now the dedicated Android app. Also reviews from Frank Bredlow, Jim Pittman, Mike McIntyre, and someone who identifies himself as a Google user put in the very first one. And he said, so glad to have the long-awaited Android app. This is the best aviation podcast out there and is making our pilots and skies safer. So if you want to go ahead and leave a review, please go ahead and do that on whatever app that you use, particularly if you're using our dedicated iOS app in the Apple Store. I would love to see more reviews for that. And of course, the benefit of the app is you can get notifications as well as some of the other things that we can upload for you for like PDFs and things like that. Let's get to some listener feedback. You may recall a number of episodes ago, I mentioned that I had flown a flight and we had forgotten to close our IFR flight plan after we landed on the ground at Watsonville, which is a non-towered airport. So it was incumbent upon us to remember to do that. And I said, hey, listeners, how do you remember to close your flight plans? Several different folks wrote in and with a few different ideas. Here's one from Bill Ayer. I saw Bill up at the AOPA seminar in Missoula. He said, you ask how pilots remember to cancel an IFR flight plan. I put a rubber band around the throttle as a reminder that there's something undone. He said, two main uses in my Malibu: to cancel IFR at a non-towered airport and to put the engine induction air back into primary if it's in alternate air for potential icing. So far, the rubber band has done its job. And he says, one comment for the impossible turn episode. He says, I use 1,000 AGL is the minimum altitude for a return to the airport. Lower than that, and he's going to land straight ahead. He says that rule helps with clarity on that decision. Thanks so much for that, Bill. It was a pleasure to meet you at the AOPA Regional Fly-In. Chris Carnahan also emailed. He's one of our Patreon sponsors. He says, I just found your podcast recently. I'm really enjoying it. I forgot to close my flight plan in a timely manner to a remote airport about a year ago. It resulted in a few terse words when I called the flight service folks. I fixed that by placing a big reminder sticker on my shutdown checklist. Hasn't failed me since. I've also started using ForeFlight to open and close my flight plan right from the cell phone, which has made it super easy. By the way, I'll mention one other method. I remember years ago listening to Pat Schaub when he was giving a presentation for AOPA's Air Safety Institute on one of the seminar tours around the country, and he said there are only two times when he moves his watch from one arm to the other. He said one was when he's filling the swimming pool as a reminder not to let the pool to overflow, and the other is if he needs to remember to close a flight plan. And by the way, on subsequent flights to the one that I mentioned where we forgot that, I did exactly that. I took my watch off my left arm, put it on my right arm, and boy, as you climb out of the airplane, it sure feels kind of funny. It is a really good reminder. Here's also email from Anton Linshow in Australia. He says, hi, Max. Hope you're well. Thanks for a fantastic podcast. He says, apologies. I have sent this later than your deadline, but I want to share my way of remembering how to cancel an IFR flight plan into non-towered airports. I use a unique feature in the Reminder app on my iPhone Apple Watch. You can set a reminder by location. I set the reminder to alert me when I'm 10 miles from the airport, and a second backup reminder at 1 mile in case of issues or I forget. This is relatively easy as it brings up a map of the area, and you can use your fingers to set a radius. As I fly into the area, the reminder goes off on both my iPhone and Apple Watch. Easy. I'm not sure about Android, as I have never used this system. Man, that is really great, Anton. I have never heard about that, and I think that's a really great idea. He says, P.S. It would be great, Max, if you could come to the Cirrus CFFP event being held in Orange in NSW, which is New South Wales, I guess, in November in Australia. And yes, I'm aware of that event. I would love to go, and it's certainly possible. So hopefully we'll get to meet some of our Australian listeners if I'm able to make that trip. Let's see, other feedback. This comes from Adam Nunn via Patreon. He says, in part, I thought you did a great job of covering the impossible turn. He said, many years ago, while still in college, I experienced an engine out at 500 feet at the end of a small field in an Aranca L3 while climbing out after a touch and go. He says, as you covered quite well in your podcast, pre-planning for the event was critical in managing it. I had already pre-planned that if an engine out were to occur while climbing out at this particular airport, that I would not do a 180 back to the field and that I would not land straight ahead as there were no safe, suitable places for landing. He said, I had pre-planned that a 90-degree left turn would set me up for a crosswind landing on a dirt road just south of the runway. Later on at the end of the message here, he says that during my training, I didn't realize that my Vietnam-era ex-C-130 gunship pilot and instructor was preparing me for engine-out situations with virtually every landing we did. I still try to land in this manner whenever possible to continue to test, hone, and prepare for engine-out situations. Max, your guidance in this podcast for preparing, planning, pre-briefing for engine out is, all capital letters, essential advice. Having experienced the situation firsthand, I couldn't agree with you more. Yes, and I think I may have mentioned in the past that part of my pre-planning when I was flying out of Reed Hillview Airport was actually to go out, drive over to and walk some of the fields that I might possibly have to put an airplane down in because it was such a crowded residential area. The only possible places were to go to some of the school playing fields, and I wanted to know exactly what the best way to approach those was to maximize the chance of surviving an engine out on such a little tiny area. Well, that's it for listener feedback for this time. As always, you can send me emails. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact, and that's the best way to send me an email. I try to include feedback on the show when I can. Of course, I read everything that I get, but I don't always get it into the podcast. Okay, let's now go back to something I recorded at AirVenture, which was an answer to a listener question.
All right. So I'm sitting here right now with a friend who I have gotten to know over a number of years, and that is Teresa Demers. She's the Executive Vice President of Marketing and Corporate Development for Lightspeed. Teresa, how are you doing?
Good morning, Max. It's great to be with you and good to be here at Oshkosh. I'm doing just fine today. Thank you.
Well, in fact, Oshkosh is where we met. I don't know if you recall, but it was back in 2012, which I think was your first year here at AirVenture. At the time, I was doing videos for EAA, interviewing people, and I happened to wander by your booth in the evening, and you guys had more people and things to transport than you had golf carts.
Right, that sounds like us, yes.
Yeah, you guys kind of said, oh, by the way, Max, could you give us it's like, oh, sure. We just piled everything into my EAA golf cart and your golf cart, and then we went running off to wherever you guys.
I think we were having a dinner or something that evening, but yes, but thank you. And it's such a great example of the kind of that fellowship of aviators, right? Everyone is just so, especially out here, everyone is just so helpful and friendly and nice. And it's a great environment. And I was so, wide-eyed. I mean, that was my first year with the company, and it was also my first year at Oshkosh. And being a pilot for a long time before that, I'd always wanted to come here. But, I never lose the excitement. Every year as we start to approach, we're getting close on the freeway, I just start to get the goosebumps, and I see the planes in the air, and I just can't wait to get on the grounds. It's just fantastic here.
It is one of those few things in life that vastly exceeds expectations.
It does, yes, yeah.
Which is wonderful. I mean, you can't really imagine what this place is like until you get here.
Right, yeah. There's no describing it. And the TV and everything doesn't do it. We got to come some year.
No, as a teenager, I used to read the pages of Flying magazine, which my good friend Rob Mark now works for. Right. And I would see the 4 pages of photos and things like that and go, oh, this looks kind of cool. But it's hard to convey in 2 dimensions or even, in video just how amazing this is. It's the best of everything in aviation, all concentrated in one spot at one time.
It is, and something for everyone. Vintage, home built, warbirds, UASs now too. It's fabulous, and the people are fabulous. People are here having fun, and they're engaged in their passion, and everybody's just enjoying it. It's great to see the kids. We can see people right now walking by with their strollers. So the kids are here, and the families are here, and then the World War II veterans are here. I saw Tuskegee Airmen at an event I was at last night, and so there's the whole gamut, and it's just it's touching to see those things as well.
Yeah, we're watching it. It looks like a 2-year-old going by in a stroller, and just in the opposite direction, we saw a senior citizen going by in his scooter, which you can rent. So I was thinking about that as I was walking in from the parking lot today. I can come to Oshkosh AirVenture for the rest of my life. I'll just be transitioning to the scooter someday.
Exactly. They've got some transportation mode for everyone here. Yeah.
That's so great. Well, so thanks for coming over to help me answer this question. Let me go ahead and read it. This is from Dan from Portland, Pennsylvania, my home state, by the way. He says, hi, Max, I'm enjoying your podcast. Please explain what an AR headset would do for me. I fly a Waco UPF-7 and have been perfectly happy with my DC headset. However, your survey results got me to wondering if an ANR headset would be an improvement. I don't spend much time on the radio, don't listen to music, have no desire to hook up to my cell phone. I still want to hear the engine going. Hearing protection is important to me, even though I wear hearing aids, which I usually turn down when flying. Thanks. So it looks like he's got multiple questions in there. And I guess let's start with the beginning. He says, why would an AR headset be an improvement for him?
Excellent. I'm happy to take that question. And there's multiple things that are going on there. With the Waco aircraft, it's a bi-wing open cockpit. And so we have a lot of customers that fly open cockpit and want to know that same question. And our advice is that with open cockpit, the active noise reduction headset will work just great. And it will really help. It will help to reduce the low rumbling engine noise. And what many pilots will do in an open cockpit or with their passengers is enclose it into a soft shell helmet. You can buy those either as a mesh or cotton or leather. And then that also kind of keeps it on the head nicely. And particularly if you're doing some aerobatics in that, which a lot of open cockpit guys do as well, pilots do as well. You can use it in a mesh. So in the open cockpits, that's our recommendation. And the one thing that we also would suggest that you add is a leather mic muff cover that you can put right over the mic muff, and that helps to remove some of the wind noise. that comes in through the microphone. So absolutely, you will have an enhanced experience in that Waco. And I have a great friend who owns a Waco, and I actually got his advice on this as well. And he uses Zulu 2s and Zulu 3s for both himself and his passengers. He said it's as quiet in the Waco with the Zulu 2 and 3 as in his Bonanza when he's using the active noise reduction headsets in his Bonanza. So that's, I think, the first part of the question. Then he also asked about hearing aids, which is excellent. And we also get that question a lot. Will the hearing aids work with an active noise reduction system, and how to sort of put that together? And so, yes. In fact, as the years have gone on, I've noticed that hearing aids are getting smaller and smaller. There may have been a time when it was hard to fit the whole assembly inside the ear cup, but now that they're so small, we have a lot of pilots that fly with the headsets with hearing aids in, and they have a great experience with that. Some pilots, depending on kind of their level of hearing loss, I think, can actually take the hearing aids out when they're flying because they've noticed that there's the reduced noise from the active noise reduction and then the improved communications, and so they don't need the hearing aids when they're wearing the headset. But either way, with or without, the hearing aid thing is great with the headsets. And then I think the third part of his question was about sort of he doesn't use the Bluetooth devices and, not interested in listening to music and stuff. And we hear that a lot too. And a lot of pilots want to just focus on their flying, and
Right.
Which is great. Several years ago, when some of the navigation apps for flight, Garmin Pilot started to put audio alerts into their apps, then pilots started to understand the audio connection had another benefit besides just listening to music and stuff. But anyways, I hope I answered kind of all three parts.
Well, so there's one other aspect I just kind of want to talk with you about. Obviously, ANR, maybe it's not obvious, it will reduce some noise more than other noise. So, for example, years ago, I used just a passive type headset, and I would fly for perhaps an hour, and I would be really beat for the rest of the day. I'd really be tired. And yet now I use ANR headsets, and I find there are often times when I'm in the cockpit for sometimes 10 hours a day if I'm on a trip going across the country, and I don't feel the kind of fatigue that I used to feel. And so it sounds to me like a lot of the reduction is down at the kind of the lower frequencies, engine noise. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure, that's a great question. You're exactly right. Active noise reduction is very good at the lower frequencies, which is part of what makes it such a great technology for aviation, because we have, no matter whether it's a helicopter, a turbine, or a piston-engined aircraft, there's a lot of low-frequency noise, and so sometimes pilots, I do a technical talk, and one of the segments in there is about dispelling the myths, because there are sometimes people who are concerned that it's going to be so quiet that if there's an anomaly with their engine, they won't hear that. And the reality is, and I've experienced this, is that it's actually what the active noise reduction is doing is removing enough of that sort of fatiguing low drone noise that an anomaly actually will come through a little bit more noticeably than if you don't have the active noise reduction on. But the other thing is it really reduces fatigue. And so that's one of the reasons now also too why there's a kind of a surge in helicopter pilots putting active noise reduction into their helmets. Because they're doing such a long work day usually. It's really a fatigue reducer. And so I'm sure you noticed after long days when you went from passive only to an active noise reduction headset that it made a difference. You felt better at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember taking a flight for the first time when I went to San Diego and back in a slow airplane, and it was 4 hours down, 4 hours back, and I thought, wow, I just flew for 8 hours and I feel fine, as opposed to flying for an hour and kind of really being beat for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
So my understanding of the active noise reduction is that it is essentially a microphone in the ear cup, and it's sampling the signal and then electronically inverts it and then plays it back through the ear cup, and those two things cancel out. And I think that actually works best when you've got very kind of constant frequencies, like you would get from an engine, turning at the same RPM. Which means if you've got a very regular, constant, unvarying noise, that's the kind of noise that's going to get knocked out the best. And so when you've got an anomaly, well, that's a change. Right. And so a change is not going to get removed because it's not part of the continuous ongoing thing that ANR does best at removing.
Right. Yeah. Well put. You're exactly right. Yeah.
Well, it's the problem of being an electrical engineer. I always have so much fun playing with the electronics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But this stuff to me is just incredibly important. Hearing protection to me is really important. I'm planning to do a episode sometime in the future where we bring an audiologist on and just talk about it. I have some hearing loss after many, many years of flying airplanes. When I started to fly, we didn't use headsets, and we were just going to yell back and forth to each other. And I think it's just such an incredibly important thing for people to start early in their career, protecting their hearing so that, they don't become like me and sit in restaurants and have a hard time hearing all the noise bouncing around. I mean, do you encounter pilots with hearing loss, and what kind of conversations do you have with folks about that?
Well, a great question. And yes, I would say most pilots will, if they're being honest, will admit that they've have some level of hearing loss. And so it's very, very common. And for people who are starting to recognize that, because it can happen pretty early. I mean, at 20s, 30s, you may start to notice it, especially if you're around a lot of loud noise, and it's cumulative and it's not reversible. So
Right.
you want to protect what you've got left, even, no matter what amount of hearing loss you have already, by putting some hearing protection devices on, and you're going to be able to protect what you've got left. And so it's really, really important. And then also put a hearing, put muffs of some sort, put, active noise reduction, we would hope, but something on your kids when they're in the back seats of the planes too, so that, they're getting protected right from the early age.
Well, it's not just the aviation environment either. I watch a kind of a very plugged-in generation
Yes.
of people with not iPads so much, but their smartphones, whether Android or iPhone, wandering around, and you can see the earbuds are stuck in their ears, and sometimes you can hear the music as you walk by, and you just know that that's turned up too loud.
Right.
And I think the problem is that you don't see the results of that for decades later.
Right.
So I really wonder if we're not going to, a couple decades from now, see a generation of people with much poorer hearing than you and I may have had.
Right. It's a good point. And I worry about that too. Yeah, exactly same thing. You see people with that stuff turned up so loud, and the kids, they don't know. I mean, we used to go to concerts, sit right in front of the speakers, and they were super loud, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
It's funny. You cut yourself, you see the blood, and you kind of go, "Oh, better not do that again." With hearing,
you don't realize.
You don't get that immediate feedback that says, "Whoa, this is
right.
This is injuring me over the long term." So,
yeah.
Well, good. So anyway, I'm a huge believer of active noise canceling headsets just to preserve hearing. Can't be any fun to get old and not be able to hear anything at all. Well, Lightspeed has been a big supporter of a program that I run in the San Francisco Bay Area. And for folks who are not familiar with it, there was a collaboration that we have down there with AOPA, with NASA Ames, and with Cirrus, and with Lightspeed. And we put on a program for the past 4 years called Accident Wise. Mm-hmm. And tell us about the kind of support you provided for us for that event.
Well, thank you. And again, it's so ironic after that fortuitous meeting, 7 or 8 years ago, whatever that was. Yep. And we've become friends since then, and we can talk later about some of the flying we've done. But it's, we appreciate the work that you're doing down there. And you make your living in aviation, but you also have a heart for giving back. And we also really appreciate that about you and about other aviators who do that as well. And so the Accident Wise is a great, great program. And really, we play a small part. I think we donate a headset, for a raffle prize that helps you maybe boost the attendance a little, get some more people there, and you're always gracious enough to invite us to set up a little table there. And so we try to send someone down and it's always someone who's like, I get to go to Moffett Field, I get to hang out with pilots for the evening, so it's easy to find someone to raise their hand for that. So thank you for the work that you do with that as well. And I know that safety is an important passion for your heart. And
it is, and Moffett Field has been part of the large drawing card. Pilots in the San Francisco Bay Area all dream of being able to land someday at Moffett Field with its pair of probably roughly 10,000-foot runways, and of course NASA Ames located right there. We would love to be able to set it up so people can get permission to fly into Moffett Field and then attend the seminar, which is right next to Hangar 1, which is a blimp hangar that dates back from the 1930s. It was built for the USS Macon. And the USS Macon, unfortunately, was only in service for about 2 years. The hangar has lived on for at least 80 years.
Amazing.
And it's kind of an iconic building as you drive down one of the main highways in Silicon Valley. So it is a fun location, and we bring about 200 pilots every May to come in and listen to various presentations. So, yes, and what we do with that headset, I take it home with me. No, that's not true.
I know it's not. You already have a Lightspeed headset.
I have several, actually.
Right.
And we put together a silent auction. And so we raise money, and that helps offset some of the expenses for the evening, as well as adds a little bit of money to the Aero Club of Northern California, which is a regional affiliate club of NAA, which, of course, is the U.S. official record keeper for everything related to aviation records. So this is one of the major Aero Club in Northern California events that we that hold each year. So that's fun.
Yeah, very cool.
Now, you came down to see me here a couple of years ago. Let's talk about that.
That was so fun. I was going to be down there on business, and my husband and I traveled down there for a vacation often too, but I needed to do some flying, and I wanted to do some flying in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I called up my friend Max and said, hey, I'm going to be in Petaluma. I need to somehow get down to Palo Alto for a meeting. And could we do some flying on whatever day that was? And so he came, picked me up in Petaluma, and we ended up doing a whole, round circuit there. And I got to say that it was such a highlight for me, being able to fly in the Bay Area and to do it with you, because I've had dual time in congested airport spaces in other cities, and I've never experienced someone who was able to do both the scenic aspect of it, and we did beautiful over the Golden Gate Bridge and stuff, but also really knew how to work the system with the controllers. And so we flew right over SFO at 1,500 feet or something.
That's right, yeah.
And had great clearances, did, just in right over the city, and then out and did some, loops around, not loops that way, but some orbits around.
We didn't do aerobatics.
No, we didn't do the kind of loops that Aaron Fitzgerald does,
right.
But some orbits out, near the Golden Gate Bridge, got some beautiful photography, and of course, every landmark down there, and it was just such a highlight, and I really, really enjoyed it. So thanks again for that. But again, your expertise in the area really showed. So anybody who wants to come out and get some dual time in a Cirrus with Max in the Bay Area, come on out and take a flight with him.
We definitely had some great fun. I've flown now in all 50 states. So I went.
Congratulations!
Thank you, Missoula, Montana, with the AOPA regional fly-in back in June.
Yeah.
Where they hired me to be speaker on IFR. That was my 50th state, and I've got to say, of all the 50 states that I have flown in, I have never seen an area like San Francisco that has so much concentrated landmarks to view from the air in a small, tight little area. So, I mean, they're literally I said half a dozen. It's about a dozen different things to point out, like, Alcatraz and the Golden Gate Bridge and downtown San Francisco and the Bay Bridge and San Quentin and a couple lighthouses. And it's just beautiful. I mean, it's spectacular. Beautiful. And then we get the fog rolling in. I shot a picture recently with just the top of one of the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge just sticking out of the fog, and posted that photo. So it is a lovely, lovely area. So
yes.
And just taking a look at Facebook here, I see a friend of mine, Jacob, has checked in. Jacob is from Watsonville, California, down at the coast, a recent private pilot who's in college. And anyway, I want to thank everybody who's joining us here on Facebook Live. I think we're going to start to wrap it up here. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Just again, we really appreciate you and what you're doing for aviation. Thanks for coming and doing the podcasts with us this week. I think you had an amazing assortment of guests, and I just had a chance to really listen to your Aaron Fitzgerald interview, shortly before I came, and I loved it when he said that the new maneuver, I think he called it the Immel flip. Yeah, I mean, it looks really cool from the ground, but it's actually really not that hard to do. Yeah, really.
Apparently.
Right.
Apparently.
So he is such a great friend of light speeds, and obviously doing a great job for Red Bull, but so humble, right? And so really fun to listen to him, and what a great pilot he is too. So, yeah.
Well, great. Thanks for making the space available to us in the tent here. This has been just a really fun, ideal location, and for all the support we've gotten here from Amber and others. This is our first year doing it, and we came up with this idea 2 weeks ago.
That's right.
So it was quite a rush to figure out all the different pieces of equipment we needed, get them all ordered, get everything all together. Not everything went perfectly, but we learned a lot in the process, and I think we'll hopefully look at doing it again in the future. Because
we'd love to have you again.
This has been great fun. Well, great. Thank you so much for having me here.
And anytime you're thinking about buying an aviation headset, well, you can find my recommendations on our headsets page. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on headsets at the top of the page, and you'll find descriptions for several popular headsets. And then if you click on any of the links and buy a headset through Amazon, I'll earn a small commission, and you'll be paying pretty much the same price you would anywhere else. You can also get to that page by tapping on the artwork on your podcast player on your smartphone. That'll take you to the show notes. Then just click on the link in the show notes that says, check out our recommended aviation headsets. You'll also see a link there for our recommended portable ADS-B receivers. And if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please don't wait. Contact me today. I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're looking at a new Cirrus, and can also help you understand all the different factors, not all of which are obvious between buying new versus slightly used. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future show, please go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Questions up at the top, and you can record your question, and I'll play it on the show and try to answer it for you. And if I could ask for your help on one more thing, please think of one, maybe two of your friends that you think might benefit from the show. If only they knew about it, then contact them today, show them how to find the show. And if they don't know what a podcast is, take them out to the App Store, tell them to download Aviation News Talk from either iOS or Android phones. Thanks so much, because that's how new people find the show, is because people like you tell them about it. Thanks so much, and until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.